In the shadowed valleys of northern England in the year 1760, where the River Irwell wound lazily through fields still tilled by hand, and the only smoke that rose came from modest cottage hearths, a silence hung heavy with the promise of unimaginable rupture. Villagers rose before dawn to the lowing of cattle and the rhythmic clack of handlooms, their lives tethered to the soil and the slow turning of seasons, unaware that the quiet click of a new mechanical shuttle would soon drown out every familiar sound. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, but already distant forges glowed with experimental heat, and ambitious men whispered of engines that could spin cotton faster than any human hand. No trumpets announced the arrival of this new age. It crept in on the wheels of ambition and necessity, yet the collapse of an entire way of life had already begun its invisible march. By the time the first factories pierced the skyline like iron cathedrals, the old world was already fracturing beneath the weight of progress, no one yet named as destruction. The Industrial Revolution did not arrive as conquest, but as a slow, relentless erosion of everything once considered eternal, and the social fabric that had bound generations for centuries was about to tear apart at the seams. The daily rhythms of pre-industrial Britain unfolded in a world still governed by the land and the limitations of muscle and wind. Families gathered in timber-frame cottages where the hearth served as both kitchen and workshop, mothers and daughters spinning wool by firelight, while fathers and sons worked the fields under open skies that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Children learned their trade at their parents' sides, not in distant mills but in the warm familiarity of shared labor, where meals were simple, conversation flowed freely, and the night brought a darkness so complete that stars seemed close enough to touch. The community was small and interdependent, bound by church bells and harvest festivals, where poverty existed but hunger rarely stalked alone because neighbors shared what little they had. Sounds of life were organic and intimate. The creak of a wooden loom, the laughter of children chasing geese across common land, the distant ring of a blacksmith shaping tools that would last a lifetime. This was existence measured not in profit but in survival and continuity, a fragile equilibrium that had endured for generations, yet forces were already gathering that would render such simplicity obsolete and leave entire villages hollowed out like forgotten ruins. Early warning signs flickered like distant lightning on the horizon, invisible to most but unmistakable to those who paused long enough to notice. The Enclosure Acts swept across the countryside with bureaucratic precision, fencing off ancient common lands that had sustained the poor for centuries, forcing smallholders into wage labor or desperate migration. Populations swelled under improved diets and rudimentary medicine, creating mouths that the old agrarian system could no longer feed, while inventors in smoky workshops tinkered with devices like the spinning jenny and the water frame that promised to multiply output 100-fold. Rivers once clear and teeming with fish began to carry strange chemical residues from experimental dye works, and in market towns, merchants spoke in hushed tones of machines that never tired and required no wages beyond coal and oil. Yet these murmurs were dismissed as the eccentric dreams of tinkerers. No one connected the dots between rising rents, displaced families, and the growing hunger for raw cotton shipped from distant colonies. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly in ledgers and patents, in the subtle shift from human hands to mechanical precision that promised wealth for the few while quietly unraveling the livelihoods of the many. As the first textile mills rose along the fast-flowing streams of Lancashire and Yorkshire, tension coiled like a spring beneath the surface of daily existence. Workers streamed from rural hamlets into hastily built mill towns, trading the open fields for narrow streets where the air grew thick with coal dust and the constant roar of water wheels and spinning frames drowned out conversation. Factory owners, driven by the relentless logic of competition, extended working hours into the night, illuminated only by the flickering glow of tallow candles and later gas lamps that cast long, eerie shadows across rows of exhausted faces. Families that once labored together now found themselves separated by iron gates and strict overseers, their bodies bent to the rhythm of machines that cared nothing for human frailty. The scent of machine oil mixed with unwashed bodies and the acrid bite of chimney smoke that stained stone walls black within months. But no one understood what was coming next. The promise of steady wages masked the deeper fracture forming between those who owned the machines and those who merely fed them, a divide that would soon widen into an unbridgeable chasm of resentment and despair. Key decisions made in the polished drawing rooms of London and Manchester accelerated the rupture with cold calculation. Parliament embraced laissez-faire doctrines that left factory conditions unregulated, believing the invisible hand of the market would somehow correct every excess. Investors poured capital into steam engines and ironworks, ignoring the human cost because profit margins demanded it, while local magistrates turned a blind eye to the exploitation of children as young as 5 who crawled beneath whirring looms to clear debris. The pressure of global competition with France and the insatiable demand for cotton from American plantations pushed owners to extract every ounce of labor before machinery wore out or markets shifted. In the boardrooms, voices spoke of progress and national glory, yet the decisions that mattered were those made in the counting houses where a child's broken fingers were tallied as minor operational losses. These choices were not born of malice alone, but of a system that had begun to value output over existence itself, and the mounting instability in the streets below was treated as mere inconvenience rather than the first tremors of systemic failure. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single cataclysm, but through 1,000 small fractures that spread like cracks in ice under sudden weight. In the overcrowded mill towns of the 1820s and 1830s, cholera and typhus swept through alleys, where raw sewage mingled with factory runoff, turning rivers into open sewers that glowed with unnatural colors under moonlight. Workers' bodies, once resilient from farm labor, now withered under 16-hour shifts in air thick with cotton lint that clogged lungs and caused a wasting disease known as bisonosis. Strikes erupted sporadically, met with military force, while the Luddites in earlier years had already smashed frames in feudal protest, their hammers ringing against iron in the dead of night before soldiers hunted them down. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. The old social bonds of mutual obligation had dissolved into contractual labor, and entire generations found themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty that no amount of personal virtue could break. The collapse was not dramatic fire and ruin, but the slow suffocation of hope within the very engines meant to liberate humanity. Human consequences unfolded in scenes of profound and haunting degradation that scarred the collective memory of the age. Children with stunted growth and twisted limbs shuffled home from mills at midnight, their small hands raw and bleeding, eyes hollow from lack of sleep and sunlight, while mothers worked beside them knowing that one missed shift meant eviction into the workhouse. Slums grew like fungal growths around factory gates, wooden tenements stacked so closely that daylight barely reached the ground floors, where families of 8 shared a single room reeking of damp and despair. The silence of exhaustion replaced the laughter of earlier generations. Fear of unemployment haunted every meal of thin gruel and boiled potatoes. Domestic violence and alcoholism surged as men, stripped of their traditional roles as providers and protectors, sought escape in gin shops that glowed with false warmth along rain-slicked streets. Social breakdown was visible in every gaunt face and every unattended grave in the pauper cemeteries, where the dead were buried without ceremony because the living could not afford dignity. The very fabric of family and community had unraveled, replaced by a new order where survival demanded submission to the machine and the market. Long-term historical impact rippled outward like shock waves from a seismic fault, reshaping not only Britain but the entire trajectory of modern civilization. The social fractures of the Industrial Revolution gave birth to trade unions and socialist thought, as thinkers like Marx and Engels walked the same soot-covered streets of Manchester and documented a system that devoured its own people. Factory acts and public health reforms emerged only after decades of suffering, yet the environmental legacy lingered in blackened skies and polluted waterways that foreshadowed the ecological crises of later centuries. Urbanization became permanent, with cities swelling into metropolises where millions lived in conditions once unimaginable, and the class antagonisms born in those mills fueled revolutions across Europe in 1848 and beyond. The world that emerged was wealthier, faster, and more interconnected, yet it carried within it the permanent scar of a social order sacrificed on the altar of progress, where human value was measured in productivity and the quiet dignity of pre-industrial life was consigned to romantic memory. What began as mechanical innovation had irrevocably altered the relationship between labor and capital, between community and commerce, leaving a blueprint for both unprecedented advancement and recurring collapse. Even today, the echoes of that rupture haunt the structures of our own age, a reminder that every leap forward carries the seeds of its own undoing. The factories have evolved into global supply chains and automated assembly lines, yet the same invisible pressures, inequality, environmental degradation, the alienation of labor persist in new forms that would be instantly recognizable to those who once toiled beneath the spinning jennies. The Industrial Revolution taught humanity that progress is never neutral. It demands sacrifice, and the social breakdown it unleashed was not an accident, but the inevitable consequence of prioritizing machines over men. In the quiet moments between shifts, When the roar of engines momentarily fades, one can almost hear the faint voices of those long-dead workers asking whether the price was worth the gain. The collapse did not end with the Victorian era. It simply changed shape, embedding itself in the foundations of modernity, where the tension between innovation and human endurance remains unresolved. What was lost in those smoke-filled valleys was more than cottages and handlooms. It was a certain wholeness of existence that no amount of steam power could ever restore.